I look in the mirror, and I don't know who that is.
I could be looking straight at something I just don't know what I'm looking at. It's almost as if I am daydreaming. There is no sense, no meaning in what I see.
One man can't recognise everyday objects. Another can't recognise faces. Damage to their brains is preventing them from making sense of the world. If it's the brain that sees, how does it do it? How does our brain manage the immense task of generating vision? Las Vegas, the brightest city on Earth, a city that erupts every night into an explosion of light. It feels as though we see it all without effort, but our brains are working away frantically.
Vision seems so simple. We just open our eyes and we see what's there. But in fact, we're taking on an awesome challenge. What's actually hitting our eyes is a jumble of light. And transforming this jumble into the complex world we know demands a phenomenal amount of brain power. Yet we do it all in the blink of an eye.
Every aspect of everything we see has to be constructed inside our heads. Movement, shape, colour, size, what everything is, and where it is. Nothing in the world is simply there. It all has to be pieced together by the brain.
The more we learn about how the visual system actually works, the more it seems to contradict the actual experience of sight. Information coming into our eyes is dismantled and reassembled so convincingly that we never realise what's actually going on.
As neuroscientists gradually discover the elegant tricks and bold shortcuts the brain uses, it's becoming clear that our mental image of the world is only loosely based on reality. Could our experience of just seeing what's out there be an elaborate illusion? Even the most basic features of vision are constructed by the brain. The most compelling evidence for this comes from the study of extremely rare cases of highly selective brain damage. "20 years ago, Gisela Leopold suffered a stroke. It left her unable to see motion. Everything she sees is frozen, even though her other senses shout out that the world is moving by. For Gisela Leopold, looking at a moving object is an unsettling experience.
Weil mich das ja furchtbar stört, wenn die schnelle U-Bahn da kommt. Das ist für mich nicht angenehm. Wenn überhaupt was zu mir herkommt, das ist noch schlechter. Es ist besser, wenn es weiter weg ist.
Faced with the massive amount of visual information coming into our eyes, it seems we divide up the task of building the scene in our heads into different components. And Gisela has lost one vital component of her visual world.
my first impression was that it's something really very strange. And when I asked her, now, what is your problem? She told me, I can't see objects in motion. And like others, I didn't believe it, because nobody has ever described a case like this. So, Frau Leibold, wenn Sie bitte die Augen wieder aufmachen. Wieder zum Schirm schauen. Jetzt geht es um Folgendes. Sie sagen immer ja, bitte, wenn sich ein Punkt bewegt.
Ah ja? No.
Professor Joseph Zill has studied the unique phenomenon of Gisela Leopold for 20 years. His tests reveal how she now struggles to make sense of the world. She relies on the fact that the static image she is seeing is eventually updated. After a delay of a few seconds, she can deduce that something is moving if the snapshot in her mind has changed. Gisela Leopold's stroke damaged a small area at the back of her brain. What makes her unique is that the damage was precise and also symmetrical. This accident of chance proves that when damaged, particular brain regions can selectively prevent the processing of movement.
It is very difficult to imagine how the world of Frau Leibold may look like. Although she cannot see movement in the sense of tell us whether something is moving or not, or tell us the direction of movement or the speed of movement, moving objects appear to her as restless. And this is what makes her feel very unwell and irritates her and makes life so difficult for her.
Ich guck möglichst dann nicht mehr in, wenn man so vor mir ist und sich das bewegt. Ich guck dann meistens auf eine andere und wo nicht so viel bewegt oder.
Our eyes only capture static images, still photographs of the world outside. These images travel to the back of the brain, where they are incorporated into the sensation of seeing movement. And we now know that different aspects of vision are dealt with by different visual subsystems. No one knows why the brain is organized this way, but it makes sense to me that this division of labor is the most efficient way for coping with everything that's bombarding the eye.
If the brain would be built in a way that only one structure or one mechanism or one module would have to process all the visual information which is coming in, then it would take much longer time. So the solution is to have smaller visual areas, smaller mechanisms, and each mechanism is dealing with just one aspect of visual information like form or color or depth or movement.
Gradually, neuroscientists are building up a detailed map of this parallel processing. The raw jumble of information from the eyes travels to the primary visual cortex and on to a series of increasingly specialized areas for processing. So far, over 30 different areas have been discovered, working on motion, color, depth, shape, and even which way an edge is pointing. We can't say yet exactly what they all do, but recently, an underlying logic to this assortment of areas has been uncovered.
Okay, so if you close your eyes.
These two bars are exactly the same size. It seems as though my visual system has been totally fooled by this illusion. But this experiment proves that's not the case.
Okay, if you open your eyes again, can you tell me which looks longer, if either of them do?
Yes, this one looks longer.
Fine, okay. And when I say...
The precise movements of my fingers are tracked by a special set of cameras as I reach for the bars.
Perfect.
If my entire visual system has been fooled, then my grasp should be wider for the bar that looks bigger.
And open them. And tell me again, are they the same or different?
No, this looks bigger.
Okay. So when I say go, pick up the one on the right. 2, 1, go. Great.
The movements of my fingers reveal a fascinating aspect of the workings of my brain. The bars look different lengths, but my fingers shape to pick them up in exactly the same way for each. Part of my visual system, which is guiding my hand, has not been tricked by the illusion and is acting independently of what I'm consciously seeing. This kind of ingenious research shows that all the specialized visual areas are organized into 2 different pathways with very different roles. One pathway, which was guiding my hand, helps us interact with the world. We're unaware of it, but every movement we make is fed by information from this pathway. The more laborious task of recognizing what things are is handled by a different pathway. Maybe that's so we don't have to wait until we know what something is before we move to deal with it.
It seems my hand can ignore what I think my eyes are actually seeing, because these 2 tasks are treated so separately in the brain. We don't yet fully understand why this segregation occurs, but of the 2, it is the recognition system that seems to take up more brain power. Recognition is a vital part of our visual system. It turns seeing into understanding.
Of all the things we need to recognize, there's one which is fundamental to how we live our lives: the human face. It's how we know who someone is, whom we love, whom we hate, and whom we fear. Our brains seem tuned to spot faces.
We have so much hardware in our heads that is dedicated to recognizing faces. It takes almost nothing to make us see a face. I mean, just a big chunk of our brain is saying, where's the face? Where's the face? So, you know, the most minimal configuration of lines and a couple of curves will look like a face. Even, you know, clouds, the man and the moon, just, you know, the pattern of craters on the moon we see as a face.
But Lincoln Holmes finds recognizing a face impossible. 30 years ago, he was in a car accident that damaged an isolated part of his brain, and he is now completely face blind.
On those moments when I am suddenly alone and I don't know where anybody that I'm with is, there can be a surge of fear, and it's lonely in that sense. The very thought of something so basic as recognizing faces being lost is not only hard to imagine, but it's pretty scary. One of the things that makes it hard for people to believe that I have such a deficit is that I'm not blind. I see them. And seeing in our vocabulary is synonymous in some ways with understanding. I see what you mean. And it's very hard for folks to understand that I can see them and not know who they are.
Sometimes it seems like maybe he recognizes me because I'm in the right place at the right time. I've said we're going to meet at such and such a location, and he finds me and he says, "Hi, Holly." But I think it's because we've made pre-arrangements that, yes, we're going to meet at X place at X time.
Maybe another way to put that is that when there are just the 2 of us sitting here, it's one thing. When we go out to the supermarket, say, and get separated, then there are a couple of dozen female faces walking all around, I haven't got a prayer.
Right.
I haven't got a prayer.
Right.
I haven't got a prayer of picking you out of all those faces.
What's that?
That's a key.
Great.
That's an apple.
Okay.
That's a place setting with a knife, fork, and spoon and a plate.
All right. Who is it?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. Young woman, old woman?
To be very honest, I'm having trouble answering that question.
Well, let me give you some biographical details. She's a movie star from the 1950s, very glamorous. She sang Happy Birthday to President Kennedy once.
Marilyn Monroe?
Yes.
Marilyn Monroe, as you know, had a close affiliation with more than one Kennedy. But that's neither here nor there.
Right.
When I'm asked by people sometimes, do faces just all look the same? The answer to that question is that no, they don't all look the same. And they say, well, why don't you recognize them? And the answer is, they don't all look the same, but they don't all, in other words, they don't all look like John Smith. None of them look like anyone. They all are faces, but they are not recognizable as anyone's face. Any of them.
He sees the skin, he can see the texture of the skin, he can see the individual features fairly well. But what he doesn't see is the totality of the face. He can't simultaneously apprehend all of those different parts together. And that's what we have to do to be able to recognize a face.
It's hard to imagine what Lincoln is actually seeing when he looks at a face. It seems that his brain is not allowing him to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Instead, he is confronted with a jumbled up mixture of features which he cannot connect with even the most familiar of faces.
Okay, how about that person?
Don't know.
Any sense of familiarity?
No.
No. What about there's a child's face sort of looking over his shoulder. Any familiarity there?
This is the nastiest one of all, isn't it?
Yes.
This is me.
Yes. How do you feel looking at a picture of your own face and not recognizing it?
For me, it is a face. It's not my face. It's a face. And there is some sense of incompleteness there. But so be it.
Lincoln's story has helped reveal how our brains process faces. Each time we look at another human being, a specific facial recognition system is activated. It turns out that this system is so specialized, it only deals with faces which are the right way up. It seems that facial recognition is such a demanding and important part of our lives that we need to dedicate a whole subsystem of the brain to this task. And the work with Lincoln suggests that this face area plays no role in recognising any other type of object.
Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay.
Yeah, absolutely right. Good.
Albert Einstein.
Good.
It's oblong. It's got lots of legs on it. There's a black thing at the top of it. Don't know what it is.
If I told you that it was a kind of scrubbing brush, and what you refer to as the legs are actually the bristles.
Oh, okay.
The black part at the top is actually just a shadow that's falling from the lighting. It's not actually part of the object itself.
Okay, I can see how that could be a scrubbing brush.
Okay.
But I didn't get it.
Uh-huh.
In Ottawa, Kevin Chappell provides another vital clue to the brain's visual recognition system. He has no trouble with faces, but a car accident has left him totally unable to make sense of the world. He sees all the details, but not what things are.
Well, after all these years, I've kind of got used to it now. It's me, it's how I am, it's my world. Often I'll let things just pass me by. If I have to, then I'll make an effort to figure out what it is. For example, the upper part of what I'm seeing is blue, therefore probably sky. The green is obviously, if it's sticking up, it creates the skyline. It's there are trees. If it's flat, it's grass. That's how I make my sort of judgments about where I am. Many times I'm wrong.
It's a very interesting and fairly rare condition whereby the eyes are working just fine and can take in the light from the visual world in a perfectly normal fashion.
Rosie, Otto.
The problem is, in Kevin's case, in being able to decode these signals and produce a coherent interpretation of the world. So it's not like he has lost his knowledge of what objects are, and it's not like he simply cannot produce the name for it. Maybe he's just forgotten what the word is. None of those can account for his problem. The problem is an inability for the information from the visual world that's coming into his brain to make contact with this knowledge that he has about objects.
I really don't know what the coloured squares.
Mm-hmm.
There are some faces in the squares. I can see 7 faces.
Mm-hmm. What about in the parts where there aren't faces?
There were just red blotches and black blotches. Mm-hmm. Oh, they could be playing cards.
Mm-hmm.
The blotches is like.
So it's interesting that you were so rapidly able to pick up the faces,
Right.
but the suits somehow didn't quite make sense to you.
Increasingly clear that the brain segregates objects from faces. But we still don't fully understand why or how this compartmentalization occurs. What is so special about faces that means they need separate processing in the brain?
One reason might be that faces actually look very similar. So a specialized area within the brain is required with a finer, more powerful level of processing. Without this facility, we'd be able to spot a face, but we wouldn't be able to distinguish whose face it was. object recognition seems to be a simpler task. It doesn't need such a high level of processing. Once we've named an object, we don't normally need to take the recognition task any further, and so a more basic part of the brain is used. But even with all these specialized systems working away, the brain would be overloaded if it tried to tackle every detail of every object at once. So we just don't bother. We're all equipped with the means of selecting the key aspects of a scene one at a time. This attention system allows us to concentrate on one thing, while the rest of the world falls into the background.
All this happens so automatically that we don't notice it. But our brains are constantly scanning the scene, not just passively analysing what's coming in, but actively deciding what it is it wants to see. It seems that we don't just have to point our eyes in the right direction, we also have to point our brains.
The difference between these two men seems obvious. Their faces are different, their hair is different, even their shirts are a different colour. And yet an experiment by psychologists Dan Simons and Chris Chabris at Harvard reveals that our brains actually process very little of what comes in through the eyes.
In this experiment, a subject comes up to a counter and a first experimenter hands them a consent form. As soon as they finish signing the consent form, they hand it back to the first experimenter, who then takes the consent form, ducks down behind the counter to put it away, and a different experimenter then stands up and hands the subject a packet of information and sends them into a hallway where we ask them questions about it.
This wonderful experiment uncovers an aspect of the brain's attention system known as change blindness.
Change blindness is the idea that we often miss large changes to our visual world from one view to the next. We're often not able to see large changes that would appear to be perfectly obvious to somebody who knows they're going to happen.
And incredibly, in 75% of cases, the subjects don't notice a thing.
The lady who took me up here, she opened the door for me and told me to walk over to the desk.
This form.
All right. I think there was a sign that said experiment. And a man there gave me a form to sign.
There was the guy standing under a big sign that said experiment, and to my left there was like a pot with some dirt in it and some plastic containers.
Is it the fifth?
Oh, I filled out a form.
Okay.
Right.
This form. How long would it be about before it's...
And I asked him how long it would take. He said about 10, 15 minutes or so.
I guess I have the time to do that.
Did you notice anything unusual at all after you signed the consent form?
I just signed it, and I didn't even pay attention to anything that was written on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
After you handed it back to him, did you notice anything unusual happen at all?
If you could just take this into the next one.
No, I probably wasn't even looking that direction. I probably turned and looked towards the clear door. I saw some people there.
Okay.
Then I turned back and looked at him for a second.
Okay. Did you notice anything unusual at all after you signed the consent form?
No.
This is only going to take 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah, it'll be real short.
Okay.
The person who stood up was actually a different person.
Okay.
I gather you didn't notice that was different?
No.
A different person actually stood up and handed you this form and sent you out toward me. I gather from your action you didn't notice that?
No.
Okay. Don't feel bad about that. Actually, most of the time, we find about 75% of people don't notice.
You serious?
Yeah. The person who stood up with the packet was actually a different person.
Wow.
Than the first person.
That is incredible.
So I gather you didn't see it then.
I didn't catch that, no.
Okay. What's really interesting is that some people notice these changes and other people don't notice these changes.
Okay, if you could just take this.
And we really don't yet have a good idea what separates those people who don't from those people who do. It might be that there are individual differences and some people are better able to detect these sorts of changes. But it's also possible that it's just coincidence, that the people who noticed it just happened to be focusing on a feature that changed, They just happen to be paying attention to the color of the person's shirt. And the people who failed to notice it just happen to be paying attention to something else.
The brain's attention system allows us actively to select what to look at. It makes us very good at concentrating on tasks, but it can also make us miss something happening right in front of our eyes. Magic is all about making us think we are seeing everything, when in fact we are missing the most important thing of all. Magicians exploit the brain's attention system to the extreme, but understanding how attention is organized in the brain has been a difficult challenge. Once again, it's damage to the brain, which reveals much about how the normal brain functions. The attention system is often affected after injury to the right-hand side of the brain. This leads to a condition known as neglect. Neglect leaves patients with a baffling syndrome, as if half their world has disappeared.
Neglect is a very difficult concept. It's a medical term that has been used for almost 100 years to describe a variety of behavioural conditions. That is what patients actually do when they've had a stroke. And most of these patients have strokes involving the right hemisphere, right part of their brain. And basically what they tend to do, which is descriptive of neglect, is they ignore one side of space. So, for instance, they dress one side of their body, they write on the right-hand side of the page, they miss things on the left-hand side.
The stroke that Peggy Palmer suffered 10 years ago has left her with extreme neglect of the left-hand side of her world. Peter Halligan has spent many years testing Peggy to try and understand exactly what is going on in her brain.
Sure.
This time, Peggy, I'm going to show you this picture of a cat, and I'd like you to draw it as accurately as you can.
Right, okay.
Neglect has very little, if anything, to do with your eyes. The vast majority of the problem arises from the brain processes involved in attention. And that your attentional system provides for where your eyes move. So in other words, if something happens in my visual field that's interesting, I'll move my eyes there. But why would you move your eyes there? Only if your attentional system indicated you needed to move there. So your eyes are slaves to your attentional system. And what's wrong in neglect is the attentional system has been damaged. You notice that this cat has got two tails.
No, I didn't notice that.
Look, so you don't have it on that side, do you?
No.
Is there anything else missing in it? You, for instance, look around the left-hand side. Is there anything?
That looks missing. Yes, that shoulder's missing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
The other part of the body is, isn't it?
I don't think about it, you see.
So you thought you'd drawn a complete cat with all the details?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
When I show this to you now, and you're seeing this again, does this surprise you?
I was very surprised to see that other tail. Very
Right.
surprised, yeah.
And what do you think when you
Because
see...
I really didn't see that at all.
And what do you think when you see something like this now, when I draw attention to
I
it?
don't know how I could have missed it.
Hmm.
I don't know how I could have missed it. I really don't.
Peggy, as far as I'm aware, never reports, when you ask her afterwards, seeing half a cat. In fact, I can draw a half a cat and show it to her, and she'll say that's a half a cat, and she can distinguish between a half cat and a full cat, so she can know the difference. What she draws is different to what she actually seems to see inside her brain.
So Peggy is actually seeing a whole picture. Her brain is filling in the gaps, completing the parts that are missing. Peggy's neglect reveals another vital aspect of the brain's visual system. In her mind, her drawing is complete. What is missing on paper is generated by her imagination. The power of our imagination is what makes a good horror film so frightening.
It isn't necessarily what's up on the screen that really gets our pulses racing. It's what we think is on the screen. It seems that the less we see, the more we imagine. And filmmakers have learnt that there's nothing more vivid than the pictures we can generate inside our head.
But the imagination isn't just active occasionally. Research increasingly suggests that our brains are constantly distorting what we see. Using imagination, our brains take a bold shortcut. We guess what's out there from past experience, rather than having to build up the image in our minds each time from scratch.
Every moment we open our eyes, our brains are filling in a vast amount of additional information. The brain doesn't just allow us to see what's out there, it actually invents much of it. And over the last few decades, neuroscientists have slowly begun to understand how we can create this highly personal inner world.
If you look around, the world seems to be high resolution, almost photographically sharp and complete. But in fact, you're actually taking in remarkably little. A lot of what you see or you think you're seeing, you're actually filling in from memory. You're actually completing from information that's been stored from previous times, previous experiences with the world.
How the brain does this has baffled scientists for decades. But in recent years, an extraordinary theory has emerged. Anatomical studies have revealed that the visual brain relies as much on information coming from our memories as from our eyes. We are using our knowledge of everything we've ever seen in the past to imagine what is actually out there.
One of the most remarkable facts about the brain is that of the 32 known visual areas, virtually all of them that send a connection to another area receive a connection backwards from that area. And those backwards connections are of comparable size to the forward one. So there's enormous amount of information flowing backwards.
The discovery of these pathways has completely revolutionized our understanding of the visual brain. We can no longer think of vision as a one-way street, with information flooding in from the outside world. Instead, it seems to be a two-way street, with massive amounts of stored information flowing backwards from deep inside the brain.
So that's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it makes it easier. You don't have to register every little thing that's out there. But on the other hand, it's dangerous. You can see things, quote-unquote see, that aren't really there.
So our perception of the world is affected as much by what our brains expect to see as what is actually in front of us. This room looks normal, but in fact it's massively distorted. The girls are exactly the same size, and yet your brain won't allow you to see them that way. You can't tell that the left side of the room is much bigger than the right side, or that the floor slopes down to the left corner, and that the furniture has been specially designed to fool your brain. All this creates the illusion that the girl is changing size as she walks across the room. Your brain simply will not let you see the room as it actually is. Instead, it uses its store of memories to take a shortcut, creating an image of this room based on how you expect all rooms to look. It's an astonishing example of how much our visual memories, our imaginations, can influence what is right in front of our eyes.
Way to give and then go.
Kevin Chappell helps us understand the process at work. When he walks onto a football field, he doesn't understand a thing. He sees green, but doesn't recognize the grass. He coaches the local football team, even though the moving white object doesn't come together in his head as a ball. Kevin uses his memories from before the accident, which damaged his brain, to imagine what is in front of him. These images are so vivid, it allows him to hide how little he actually sees.
I still have the knowledge of what objects are based upon my visual memory. and the ability to imagine. You're on a green field, and the ball's round and it's white, and you kick it. But
Come on, in the middle there.
when the players get in together and they're sort of tackling each other and there's sort of a scramble in the goal mouth, I can't tell you what's going on. It's like this collage of different colours and movement.
Give it to him.
It's the images stored inside his brain that allow Kevin to cope with the world around him. His brain damage has left these pathways undamaged, even though his recognition system is completely destroyed.
Go ahead.
It's a kind of a plate with writing on it.
Why don't you go and hold it? Go on. Go ahead and hold it. Close your eyes.
Feels like an old 45.
Mm-hmm. Do you have an image now in your mind of what that is?
It's a 45 with the centre punched out.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Don't let them make...
Bizarrely, Kevin can use his imagination to draw objects he can't recognise in the real world.
Go on. Good luck.
You know, let's go ahead and do some drawing. Why don't we start off by getting you to draw something like a scrubbing brush?
Okay.
Kevin presents to us a very clear example of a person who, unable to recognize objects, is nevertheless able to see those same objects in his mind's eye. In other words, to be able to have very detailed and distinct and rich visual mental imagery. That's pretty good. So that's kind of the handle, and these are all the bristles coming down.
Yes, and it's also, I've tried to give some depth to it as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just like the other drawings, which are just 2D. It's the 3D drawing.
Good.
There seems to be a complete split between what Kevin can see and what he can imagine. He can't even recognise his own drawings.
Do you have any idea what this is?
Tape player.
Mm-hmm. It's actually a bicycle. And it's something that you yourself have drawn for me previously. This is your drawing of a bicycle. It doesn't look familiar to you?
No, it doesn't look like a bicycle either.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Mm-hmm. It's very surprising to find a patient like Kevin who shows a dissociation between visual mental imagery and perception. The received wisdom in this area has been that visual mental imagery and visual perception are simply two sides of the same coin. It's just that one proceeds from the outside world inwards and the other one proceeds from the brain in a downwards fashion. In fact, having a patient who shows a dissociation like this suggests that these two processes are really not one and the same, as has traditionally been argued.
Kevin's condition has revealed a separation between the parts of the brain that generate imagery and the parts we use for perception. So how do these two systems fit together? That someone like Kevin exists makes it very difficult to understand where all the different components of vision are finally brought together in the brain.
There doesn't seem to be any very obvious area of the brain where the back projections and the forward projections reach each other and make contact and, eureka, a coherent interpretation of the world is provided. In fact, there probably is no such area. I think even if we were able to go and look in the brain and see whether we could identify such an area, I think we would fail in that pursuit.
It's the most intensively studied of all the senses, and yet vision remains elusive. But one by one, we're uncovering all the ingenious strategies and shortcuts our brain uses to tackle the awesome challenge of seeing. Everything we're learning takes us further and further from the simple idea that we just open our eyes and see what's there. few years ago, I worked in New York with Professor Rodolfo Linas. He's always liked making provocative claims, and now he's convinced it's time for a revolution in how we think of vision. It sounds extraordinary, but for him, seeing is just another form of dreaming.
If you consider what happens when you dream, you find that amazingly, you actually do feel pain, and you do feel surprise, and you see things and you hear things, and the people that you know talk to you in the proper language with the proper intonation. So what that tells you that dreaming and being awake are next of kin, if not exactly the same thing. Now, if this were to be the case, and this is a hypothesis, then we would begin to really understand what the brain is about, because the brain is about making images.
This idea is in complete contrast to our normal understanding of the visual system. Rodolfo believes that everything is running in reverse, with the brain creating images that are then transformed into reality by the information coming in through the eyes.
Basically, the brain is a dreaming machine. It is the brain that generates reality, secretes reality, so to speak. The reality is modulated, it's limited by the senses. We need to see, we need to perceive, we need to dream actively, because this is the only way that we can take this huge universe and put it inside a very tiny head. We fold it, we make an image, and then we project it out. And that's what we do.
We are only just beginning to understand how the brain conquers the massive challenge of perception. If Rodolfo Linas is right, then what is going on inside our brains is much more important than what is going on around us. As I see it, vision is not about simply soaking up the outside world. Instead, it's an active process which invents, ignores and distorts what's entering through the eyes.
It seems that all this is an optional extra. What counts is what goes on inside our heads, and what happens there is completely personal. It's not so much that our visual system rebuilds the outside world, but rather that we create from scratch our own private universe, our own reality.
In the next programme, what is it about our brains that has put us in charge of the planet? What is the source of our unique power to create cities and civilizations?